It is not the fall itself that kills you, according to a traditional medical proverb. At the very conclusion, there comes an abrupt halt. However, the abrupt halt is unusual in economics. When it comes to economics, dying is often a long and arduous process. This disease lasts for a long time. An automobile traveling at 100 miles per hour slowly gets a flat tire. You won't know the air is escaping until you feel a tremor in the steering wheel. Until you attempt to round a corner and realize you've lost control, the harm goes unnoticed. This is the economic history of the United Kingdom. There was no unexpected explosion in this narrative. This is the tale of a gradual strangulation. It tells the tale of a country that chose to destroy its own foundations after having been the world's workshop and banker. Although it does not deal with politics, it is the narrative of Brexit. Speeches, slogans, and buses covered with false information do not interest us. The funds are of interest to us. The hard figures that are unconcerned with issues of sovereignty and patriotism are of importance to us. You had to know that the patient was already ill before you can grasp why Brexit was the last straw. When it chose to leap over the cliff in 2016, the UK was not in peak physical condition. It had been an invalid in recovery. We must return to the year 2008, the year of the severe financial meltdown. Britain felt wealthy before 2008. Invincible, it seemed. When it came to international finance, London was the place to be. House prices increased annually, the government had enough of money to spend, and credit was inexpensive. It was a golden period. It was all a mirage, however. A catastrophic imbalance has developed in the British economy. It shifted its focus from manufacturing to wagering on other things. It replaced its factories with trading floors after selling them off. A tsunami washed over the Atlantic Ocean in 2008 when the US housing market crashed. London was one of the worst damaged cities by the tsunami. There was a near collapse of the British financial sector. To rescue Lloyds and the Royal Bank of Scotland, the government had to shell out billions of pounds. The true harm was more profound than the shame. A key component of Britain's productivity engine was destroyed in the 2008 crisis. Although it may seem a dull term, the only word that really counts is productivity. A worker's hourly value is the simple measure of their productivity. A rise in productivity leads to a rise in pay. If output increases, the national coffers will fill up. Productivity in the UK increased at a rate of about 2% per year for many years. It was a promise of a brighter tomorrow. Yet it came to a halt after 2008. It decelerated. Britain hit a wall as the United States, Germany, and France began to heal and become more efficient once again. They weren't getting more done, but the workers were putting in the same amount of effort. Here was the mystery of productivity. As they examined it, economists couldn't help but wonder. The reason the British engine had stopped working remained a mystery to them. History is rarely a straight line. It is a series of calculated risks and hidden agendas. If you find these deep dives into the forces that shape our world valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. It helps us continue uncovering the untold stories of empires and economies. Now back to the narrative. Thus, a malfunctioning system was handed down to the Conservative administration in 2010 upon taking office. Austerity measures were their response. They made the decision to drastically reduce government expenditures. Road investment was reduced. School funding was reduced. The very things that contribute to economic growth are reducing investments. They reasoned that private companies would increase spending if the government cut down. Myth busted. Apprehension gripped the business world. Investment from businesses remained low. It took the longest time for the economy to recover ever recorded. As a result, wage growth stalled for the common man. A decade of shrinking real wages was upon the British working class for the first time since the Napoleonic Wars. Behold the essential setting. When 2016 rolled along, the British populace was fuming. Their bodies ached. 8 years of slashing had passed. Their libraries had gone dark and their hospitals were in shambles. While the nurses' salaries remained frozen, the crash-causing bankers had their bonuses reinstated. The nation was a veritable minefield. It was brimming with furious, dry animosity. A spark was all that was required. A guy called David Cameron was the one who lit the fuse. As Prime Minister, David Cameron took great pride in his good fortune. He had triumphed in an election against all the odds. A vote on Scottish independence had gone his way, and he had triumphed. His winning streak as a gambler remained unbroken. Yet he was troubled. The European issue was causing divisions within his own political group. The European Union was despised by several members of his party. They couldn't get enough of it. A new party named UKIP was also taking votes away from him. A life-altering decision was therefore made by David Cameron. He proposed a general vote on Britain's membership in the European Union. He had other priorities, and he did not act on the belief that it would benefit the economy. It was risky, and he knew it. It would be disastrous, according to every economist, banker, and treasury official he spoke with. His employment depended on it. The critics from his own party were silenced by his actions. He thought he would win because he was conceited. To him, it was completely implausible that Britons would ever choose economic death. What a mistake. The British people cast their ballots on June 23, 2016. A rainstorm was brewing. Everything was in a frenzy. It had been a terrible campaign. A red bus had promised $350 million per week for the NHS if Britain left the EU, according to the Brexit campaign. Although it was deceitful, the deception was exquisite. It reassured the public that government austerity and the financial crisis were not to blame for their plight. It informed them that Europe was to blame for their poverty. They were promised a return to their former wealth by just cutting the cord. A focus on statistics was an attempt by the state camp. They made an effort to forewarn the public about supplier chains and trade tariffs. Unfortunately, a spreadsheet is no match for gut feelings. A caution cannot defeat a dream. The stock markets remained quiet when the polls closed at 10:01. Bettors in London's financial district were predicting a stay win. As compared to the dollar, the pound was trading at a high. It had a value of $150. That money was solid. One of the G7 countries used it as their currency. The outcomes were subsequently communicated. It was from Sunderland that the first warning flags were raised. The northern English city of Sunderland is home to a working-class population. A huge Nissan assembly plant is located there. Europe is that factory's primary market for exported automobiles. All of Sunderland's employment are riding on the winds of free commerce with Europe. Sunderland would vote to stay, as was to be expected. The Sunderland outcome, however, was confirmed just after midnight. By a landslide, they had decided to go. In London, New York, and Tokyo, the screens on the trading floors went red. A carnage ensued. Wagers on the incorrect horse were discovered by the traders. They began peddling pounds. In the beginning, they sold millions and eventually billions. That night, the British pound's graph resembles a precipice. It had slipped off the table. Just a few short hours later, it had fallen from $150 to $132. More than 10% of value fell. Major currencies are immune to this. When a coup takes place, this is what happens to the currencies of underdeveloped countries. No such thing ever happens to the magnificent British pound. Things started to go downhill that night. The instant the patient disconnected, the life support system is shown by the vertical red line on the trading screen. On the next day, David Cameron announced his resignation. While the nation burned, he sang a little melody to himself as he walked out of number 10 Downing Street. He departed the scene. Nothing had been planned. The campaign's leaders were completely confused about how to really quit. They resembled the dog that snatched the automobile. They were at a loss as to how to use it. The economy, however, moves on regardless of what politicians do. There was an immediate response from the economy, and that response was a freeze. Business is sabotaged by uncertainty. As a company owner, you should not invest if you are unsure about the regulations' direction 2 years from now. Building a new plant is not what you do. New employees are not being hired. While you wait, you do nothing. Investment in the British economy froze as soon as the vote was declared. In 2016, the United States, Germany, France, and Canada all continued to witness rising corporate investment, according to a graph of G7 nations' investment. The British line remains level, while theirs rises. The surface remains flat for an extended period of time. This represents the unspoken expense. Here we have the never-to-be-built factory. The equipment in question was never updated. The program in question was never purchased. This is known as the lost growth in economics. Nobody had the guts to spend it, so it just disappeared. Your pocketbook felt the instant effect. After the currency crisis, the cost of imported goods into the UK increased across the board. Almost half of the food and gasoline that Britain consumes is imported. Everything from bananas to petrol to technology suddenly cost 10–15% more. A spike in inflation was seen. Wages in real terms, which had begun to rise gradually after the crisis, were once again severely reduced. All of a sudden, the typical British household lost a lot of money. The fact that the prices remained unchanged the next day meant that they were unaware of it for some time. However, throughout the subsequent months, both the weekly purchase price and the size of the chocolate bars decreased. Every person in the country had their salary reduced. No need to be concerned, however, according to the Brexit campaigners. According to them, the currency fall was beneficial. According to them, exporters would benefit. Their reasoning was that if the pound were to drop in value, British products would be more affordable to buyers in other countries, leading to an increase in sales. The contemporary British economy was grossly misunderstood. Digging coal and selling it is not all Britain does. Things made in Britain are complicated. Cars, jet engines, and medications are all made by this company. Britain must import components in order to manufacture these items. Among its imported goods are chemicals, electronics, and steel. The raw supplies were much more costly due to the weak pound, but the finished product was cheaper. The advantage was nullified. A surge in exports did not occur. All that happened was inflation. A political nightmare ensnared Britain for the subsequent 4 years. No matter how hard the administration tried, they were unable to reach an agreement with the EU. The Brexiteers were demanding the world. In order to avoid paying taxes on their products, they yearned for complete access to the European market. However, they also sought to eliminate free movement in order to halt the influx of European labor into Britain. In addition, they want to deviate from European legal norms. No was the response from the EU. They responded, "You can't have it both ways. You can't quit paying for membership and continue using the gym." This statement immobilized the British government. Theresa May, the Prime Minister, sought a middle ground. The information were grasped by this thoughtful lady. Even though she was aware that a harsh rupture would be disastrous for the economy, she was ensnared by the party fanatics. "You betrayed us," they said. Rumor had it that she was using the back door to attempt to keep Britain in the EU. Parliament rejected all of her deals that she attempted to pass. Uncertainty intensified. Warnings were sent by companies such as Honda, Ford, and Airbus. They said, "Look, we have factories in Britain that rely on just-in-time supply chains. A car part arrives from Germany in the morning and is put into a car in the afternoon. If there are checks at the border, if there are delays, if the truck is stuck in Dover for 2 hours, the whole system breaks." Honda eventually announced it was closing its massive factory in Swindon. Thousands of jobs lost. The Brexiteers said it had nothing to do with Brexit. They said it was global trends, but Honda was keeping its factories open in the rest of the world. They were only closing the one in the country that had decided to build a trade wall around itself. In 2019, the chaos became too much. Theresa May was forced out. She was replaced by Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was the man who had driven the red bus. He was a showman. He didn't care about details. He cared about power. He promised to get Brexit done. He won a massive election victory on that slogan. People were so tired of the arguing that they just wanted it to be over. They didn't care what the deal was anymore. They just wanted the noise to stop. So Boris Johnson signed a deal. It was a terrible deal. It was a deal that erected massive trade barriers between Britain and its biggest trading partner. It was the hard Brexit that economists had warned against. But Boris Johnson lied about it. He told the public there would be no non-tariff barriers. He told business owners there would be no forms to fill in. He famously said, "Fuck business," in a private meeting. On the 31st of December 2020, Britain officially left the European single market and the customs union. The next morning, the reality hit. It was not a bang. It was the silence of trucks not moving. Small businesses were the first to die. Imagine you are a small company in Cheshire that makes artisanal cheese. Before Brexit, you could put a pallet of cheese on a truck and send it to Paris just as easily as you could send it to London. There was no paperwork. There were no checks. Now suddenly you had to fill out customs declarations. You had to have a veterinary certificate to prove your cheese didn't have diseases. You had to pay an agent to handle the logistics. The cost of sending that pallet of cheese went from 50 to 200 LBT. and the time it took went from 1 day to 5 days. For a small business, the margins are small. That extra cost wiped out the profit, and the delay meant the cheese would spoil. Thousands of small British exporters simply stopped selling to Europe. It wasn't worth it. They retreated. They shrank. The government called these teething problems. They said businesses just needed to get used to the new forms, but these were not teething problems. This was the new reality. Britain had voluntarily imposed sanctions on itself. It had taken the friction that usually exists between enemies and applied it to its best friends. The numbers began to show the damage. British trade with the EU collapsed by 15% in the first few months. While the rest of the world was seeing a trade boom as it recovered from the pandemic, Britain was seeing a trade slump. The Office for Budget Responsibility, which is the government's own independent forecaster, calculated that Brexit would reduce the size of the British economy by 4%. 4% does not sound like a lot, but 4% of GDP is £100 billion a year. It is more than the entire budget for education. It is money that simply vanished. It is taxes that are not collected. It is roads that are not fixed. It is nurses that are not hired. And then came the labor shortage. Part of the promise of Brexit was to control immigration. The British people were told that European workers were driving down wages and taking jobs. So the government ended the freedom of movement. Polish plumbers and Spanish nurses and Romanian fruit pickers could no longer just come to Britain to work. Suddenly, the farmers realized they had a problem. They relied on seasonal workers from Europe to pick the strawberries and the daffodils. British workers didn't want to do those jobs. They were hard and dirty and paid minimum wage. Without the European workers, the crops simply rotted in the fields. We saw images of farmers plowing thousands of pounds worth of vegetables back into the mud because there was nobody to pick them. The hospitality industry was hit next. Restaurants and hotels in London relied heavily on European staff. Suddenly, they couldn't find waiters or chefs. They had to cut their opening hours. They had to close at lunchtimes. But the most dangerous shortage was in transport. Britain relied on truck drivers from Eastern Europe. When they left, there was nobody to drive the petrol tankers. In the autumn of 2021, Britain faced a fuel crisis. Not because there was no petrol, but because there were no drivers to take it from the refineries to the gas stations. People were fighting on the forecourts. Old ladies were filling up water bottles with gasoline. It was a scene from a failed state. The government panicked. They tried to offer temporary visas to truck drivers. They said, "Please come back for 3 months and then go away again." The drivers laughed. They said, "Why would we come to a country that hates us and creates so much paperwork when we can work in Germany or France with no hassle?" This labor shortage did something else. It drove up inflation. If you cannot find a truck driver, you have to pay them more. If you pay the driver more, you have to charge more for the goods. This is called a wage price spiral. Usually wage rises are good if they come from productivity, but these wage rises were coming from scarcity. It was the bad kind of inflation. So by 2022, Britain was in a trap. It had low growth because of the investment freeze. It had high inflation because of the weak pound and the labor shortage. And it had falling trade because of the new borders. Economists call this stagflation. It is the worst of all worlds. But the final humiliation was yet to come. The final bullet had not yet been fired. That would happen in the autumn of 2022 with a prime minister named Liz Truss. But before we get to the catastrophe of the mini-budget, we have to look at the crown jewel of the British economy, the City of London. For centuries, London had been the banker to the world. It was the engine that subsidized the rest of the UK. The tax revenue from the banks in London paid for the hospitals in Liverpool and the schools in Glasgow. A huge part of this success was based on something called passporting rights. This meant that a bank in London could sell financial services to a client in Frankfurt or Milan without having a separate office there. It made London the gateway to Europe for American and Japanese banks. Brexit destroyed passporting rights overnight. London banks lost the automatic right to serve European clients. The Brexiteers said the city was strong enough to survive. They said London was cool and Europe was boring. They said the bankers would never leave London for Frankfurt. And in a way, they were right. The bankers didn't want to live in Frankfurt. But the money didn't care about lifestyle. The money cared about regulation. The European Union demanded that euro-denominated trades be cleared inside the EU. They forced the clearing houses to move. Slowly, quietly, the assets began to move. JP Morgan moved billions of dollars of assets from London to Frankfurt. Barclays moved business to Dublin. It wasn't a sudden exodus. It was a slow drain. 1,000 jobs here, $1 billion there. Amsterdam overtook London as the biggest share trading center in Europe. Paris started to attract the high-flying hedge funds. The city of London was still huge, but it was no longer the undisputed king. It was shrinking. And as it shrank, the tax revenue shrank with it. The golden goose was being strangled. This brings us to the psychological change. Before Brexit, Britain was seen by international investors as a safe haven. It was boring, it was stable. It had the rule of law and sensible institutions. You could park your money in London and sleep soundly. After Brexit, Britain began to look like an emerging market. It looked volatile, it looked unpredictable. It had had 4 prime ministers in 6 years. It was tearing up treaties. It was threatening trade wars. Investors started to charge a Brexit premium. This means they demanded a higher return to lend money to the British government because the risk was higher. This leads us to the moment the coffin was finally nailed shut, September 2022. Boris Johnson had been forced out by scandals. The Conservative Party members voted for a new leader. They chose Liz Truss. Liz Truss was a true believer. She believed that the problem with Brexit was that it hadn't been hard enough. She believed that the British economy was being held back by taxes and regulations. She wanted to turn Britain into Singapore on temp, a low-tax, low-regulation tiger economy. She decided to launch a mini-budget. She stood up in Parliament and announced the biggest tax cuts in 50 years. She was going to cut taxes for the rich and for corporations. But there was a problem. She didn't say how she was going to pay for it. Usually when a government cuts taxes, it also cuts spending to balance the books, or it produces a report from the Office for Budget Responsibility to show that the growth will pay for the cuts eventually. Liz Truss didn't either. She effectively said, "We are going to borrow billions of pounds to give to the rich, and we hope that magic growth will appear." She fired the top official at the Treasury. She sidelined the independent forecasters. She declared war on the economic orthodoxy. The markets listened to her speech, and then the markets destroyed her. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The bond vigilantes woke up. These are the investors who buy government debt. They looked at the UK and they saw a government that had lost its mind. They saw a country with high inflation, massive debt, and a shrinking economy deciding to borrow even more money to fund a tax cut it couldn't afford. They stopped buying UK government bonds. They went on strike. When nobody buys your bonds, the price crashes. When the bond price crashes, the interest rate yields skyrocket. In a matter of hours, the cost of British government borrowing soared, but the terrifying part was the pension funds. Most British pension funds use a strategy called liability-driven investment, or LDI. It is complex, but basically it relies on government bonds being stable. When the bond prices crashed so fast, these pension funds faced a margin call. They needed cash immediately to cover their positions. They didn't have the cash. They had to sell assets to get the cash. But selling assets drove the price down further. It was a doom loop. On the Wednesday morning after the mini-budget, the Bank of England received a terrifying phone call. The pension funds were hours away from insolvency. If the bank did not intervene, millions of people would lose a huge chunk of their retirement savings that afternoon. The Bank of England had to step in. They had to print £65 billion of new money to buy the junk bonds that Liz Truss had created. They had to bail out the country from its own prime minister. The pound crashed to its lowest level in history. It almost hit parity with the dollar. For a moment, it looked like £1 would be worth less than $1. The psychological barrier was crumbling. Liz Truss lasted 44 days. She became the shortest-serving prime minister in British history. She was famously outlasted by a head of lettuce that a newspaper live-streamed to see which would rot first. But the damage was done. But more on risk premium had been baked into the British economy. Everyone's mortgage rates went up because the government had to pay more to borrow. The banks had to charge more to lend. Millions of homeowners saw their monthly payments jump by hundreds of pounds. This was the Truss tax. It was the price of incompetence. But really, it was the price of Brexit. Liz Truss was the ultimate Brexiteer. She was trying to deliver the fantasy. She was trying to prove that Britain could defy the laws of economic gravity. The market taught her a brutal lesson. It taught her that sovereignty is an illusion. If you are borrowing money from foreigners, you can wave your flag as much as you want. But if the bond markets decide you are broke, you are broke. After Truss, the government was taken over by Rishi Sunak. He was a sensible man. He was an accountant. His job was to manage the decline. He raised taxes. He cut spending. He tried to calm the markets. He was basically doing what the IMF tells a bankrupt country to do. And that is where we are today. The UK has become the sick man of Europe again. The numbers are damning. Since the referendum, the UK economy has grown significantly less than the US or the Eurozone, and the gap is widening every year. The average British household is thousands of pounds poorer than it would have been if the vote had gone the other way. Public services are crumbling because there is no tax revenue to fund them. The NHS has waiting lists of 7 million people. Schools are literally falling down because the concrete is crumbling and there is no money to fix them. The police have stopped investigating burglaries. This is what economic failure feels like. It isn't Hollywood. It isn't Mad Max. It is waiting 12 hours in an emergency room. It is waiting 3 weeks for a doctor's appointment. It is hitting a pothole on the way to work. It is paying £6 for a block of butter. It is a gray, slow decay. And the tragedy is that it was all self-inflicted. There was no war. There was no earthquake. There was no plague that caused this. It was a choice. The British people were told they could reclaim their past glory. Instead, they mortgaged their future. They voted to pull up the drawbridge and realized too late that they had locked themselves in the dungeon. Is there a way back? Economists say it will take a generation to repair the damage. The trade deals with Australia and New Zealand are worth a tiny fraction of what was lost with Europe. The government ES-owned figures show they will add 0.08% to GDP over 15 years. That is a rounding error. It is like quitting a job that pays a $100,000 a year to take a paper route that pays $50. Rejoining the EU is politically impossible for now. The trauma is too deep. The country is too divided. So Britain is stuck. It is drifting in the Atlantic, halfway between Europe and America, but belonging to neither. It is a cautionary tale for the world. It is a lesson in what happens when you let populism drive policy. It is a lesson in what happens when you ignore experts. It is a lesson in the fragility of prosperity. Britain was a rich country. It was a stable country. But wealth and stability are not guaranteed. They have to be earned every day, and they can be thrown away in a single night. The bullet that was fired in 2016 entered the chest of the British economy. It didn't kill it instantly, but the wound never healed. It just keeps bleeding, and the patient is getting weaker every day. This is the story of how a great power became a medium power, not through defeat on the battlefield, but through a vote in a ballot box. It is the story of the suicide of a nation. We have looked at the macro economy, we have looked at the currency crash and the bond market panic. But economics is not just about graphs on a screen. Economics is about real people and real jobs. To truly understand the scale of the disaster, we have to look at the specific industries that were promised a golden age and instead received a funeral. There is no better place to start than with the fishermen. In 2016, the British fishing industry became the poster child of the Leave campaign. They were the romantic heroes of the story. The image of a rugged captain on a trawler fighting against the bureaucrats of Brussels was irresistible. They were told that the European Union had stolen their waters. They were told that if Britain left, they would take back control of the Samar Sea of Opportunity. They were promised that the foreign boats would be kicked out and the British nets would be full. It was a powerful dream. Fishing communities voted overwhelmingly for Brexit. They believed they were voting for their own survival, but the reality was a betrayal of Shakespearean proportions. When the deal was finally signed, the fishermen realized they had been sold down the river. The government had traded away their rights to secure deals for bankers and car manufacturers. The foreign boats were allowed to stay, but the British boats lost their access to the European market. The problem was not catching the fish. The problem was selling them. The British public does not eat the fish that is caught in British waters. We do not eat langoustines or whelks or spider crabs. We export them to France and Spain. Before Brexit, a truck could load up in Scotland and drive straight to a market in Paris. The shellfish would still be alive when it arrived. After Brexit, the border went up. The paperwork was immense. Every box needed a health certificate. Every truck needed to be inspected. This takes time, and shellfish do not have time. They die. We saw the tragic spectacle of Scottish fishermen landing their catch and then having to dump it into the bin because the truck was stuck at customs for 3 days. Entire family businesses that had existed for generations went bankrupt in a matter of months. The sea of opportunity became a graveyard. Then we look at the farmers, the people who feed the nation. British farmers had relied on the Common Agricultural Policy for subsidies. The Leave campaign promised that the British government would match these subsidies. They promised that leaving the EU would free farmers from red tape, but they forgot about the trade deals. To prove that, global Britain was working. The government rushed to sign a trade deal with Australia and New Zealand. They were desperate for a headline. In their desperation, they gave the Australians everything they wanted. They eliminated tariffs on Australian beef and lamb. British farmers were horrified. They have high standards for animal welfare and environmental protection. This costs money. Australian farmers have massive industrial farms with lower standards and lower costs. They can produce meat much cheaper. The British government effectively threw its own farmers under the bus to get a photo opportunity with the Australian Prime Minister. And then there was the labor crisis we mentioned in Part 1. We saw the rotting fields, but the long-term damage is worse. Many farmers have simply decided to stop farming. They are selling their land or turning it into solar farms. Britain is becoming less self-sufficient. In a world of war and climate change, Britain has decided to make itself more dependent on imported food. It is a strategic madness. Now let us move from the fields to the factories, the car industry. For 30 years, Britain had built a world-class car industry. Nissan, Toyota, Honda, and Mini. They came to Britain because it was the perfect gateway to Europe. They could build cars in Sunderland or Oxford and sell them in Berlin or Rome tariff-free. Brexit destroyed the business model. We have already mentioned Honda leaving Swindon, but the remaining factories are facing a ticking time bomb called the rules of origin. Under the Brexit deal, a car must be mostly made of British or European parts to avoid a 10% tax. But electric cars are mostly made of batteries, and batteries are mostly made in China or Korea. This means that British electric cars will soon face a massive tariff when they are sold to Europe. The car manufacturers warned the government. They said, "Fix this or we leave." The government is scrambling to build battery factories, but they are years behind. The investment went to Germany and France while Britain was arguing about sovereignty. If the car industry leaves the north of England, we'll be devastated. It will be the 1980s all over again. Mass unemployment and social decay. But perhaps the most tragic loss is invisible. It is the loss of the future. It is the loss of science. Britain was a scientific superpower. It punched way above its weight. A huge part of this success was its leadership in European science programs. The biggest one is called Horizon. It is a massive fund of nearly 100 billion euros that pays for research into cancer and climate change and AI. When Britain left the EU, it was kicked out of Horizon. The scientists begged the government to stay in. They said, "Science has no borders." They said, "We need to collaborate with the best minds in Paris and Munich." The British government used scientific research as a negotiating tool for 3 years. They flat out rejected the conditions. Funding for British scientists was cut. They were no longer recognized as leaders. Just almost all of the top researchers up and left for Europe. A lot of smart people left. By the end of 2023, the administration had finally decided to rejoin Horizon. They rejoiced over it as it was a win, but the triumph was in vain. Their 3 years of crucial study had gone unnoticed. They were no longer influential. Not as a leader, but as a subordinate partner, they were returning. Scientific progress must continue. Things continue to evolve. Restoring Britain's image as a reliable research destination will be an ongoing process that might last decades. Additionally, we need to address the Union as a whole. English, Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish citizens form what is known as the United Kingdom. Brexit has shaken our union to its very core. Remain was the vote in Scotland. Remaining a member of the European Union was the choice of 62% of Scots. English voters forced them out of their homes against their consent. The independence movement in Scotland has been stoked by this. The SNP maintains that seceding from the UK is Scotland's only option for re-entering the global community. The disintegration of the United Kingdom is now a distinct possibility due to Brexit, with the most critical fissure being in Northern Ireland. The region of Northern Ireland is complex. The Troubles, a civil conflict, lasted for 30 years. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 brought to a lasting peace. The eradication of the border between what is now Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland was a fundamental component of that peace. One could travel all the way from Belfast to Dublin without noticing they had crossed a boundary. Because of this, the island felt more unified, which pleased the nationalists. Since they were still considered part of the United Kingdom, that made the Unionists delighted. The fragile equilibrium was disrupted by Brexit. There would have to be a border if the UK did decide to leave the EU. The presence of the boundary on land would incite conflict. Returning would be the watchtowers. The bombs might return, and therefore Boris Johnson consented to have the border established in the Irish Sea. While the rest of the United Kingdom exited the European Union's single market for goods, Cameron consented to an agreement that essentially kept Northern Ireland within. Here we have an economic idiocy. As a result, a truck transporting sausages from Liverpool to Belfast was compelled to clear customs. A nation had imposed trade restrictions on its own citizens. Angry Unionists swept Northern Ireland. Someone had deceived them. For them, it seemed like the UK was trying to force them out. Protests caused the Northern Ireland political administration to fall. For a period of 2 years, Belfast was without a functional government. More rioting broke out in the streets. Brexit has this hidden cost. Forget any monetary considerations. There will be no war. To appease the ideological fixation of a few of London politicians may have resulted in the rekindling of a war. In such case, what are the people's options? Society's agreement. The generation gap in voting for Brexit is the most tragic statistic. Up to 73% of young adults chose to preserve the status quo. Of those voting, 60% were 65 and over. The youth have never forgiven the elders for voting to alter their destiny. The average British 25-year-old feels like someone has taken something from them if you speak to them today. There were 27 other nations where they might live, work, and love. The next day, they might get up and go to Paris, Berlin, or Barcelona without a visa or any trouble at all. That entitlement was revoked. They had no choice but to stay on an island that is falling into poverty. Staggering rents, mountainous student loans, and an economic downturn are all challenges they must contend with. They consider the generation that came before them, which had free college, affordable housing, final salary pensions, and now Brexit. Their animosity runs deep. Until the current elder generation dies off, this cultural wound will persist. A monarchy riven by strife is the result. City life versus rural life. The young and the aged, the educated and the uneducated. A unified nation was a stated goal of the Brexiteers. The result was a cultural war that has since tainted all discussions. Brexit inevitably comes up in every conversation on commerce, water quality, or even the Eurovision Song Contest. What about the assurances of reclaiming control of the borders? What a sad irony. Anxieties about immigration fueled the Leave movement. Posters depicting migrants were displayed. Reducing the numbers was their stated goal. However, the number of people migrating to the UK has soared since Brexit. More than 600,000 individuals migrated in 2022. Their origins are what set them apart. The employees from Europe departed. It was time for the baristas, truck drivers, and nurses to go home. The government had to provide hundreds of thousands of visas to workers from the Philippines, India, and Nigeria to fill their positions. As a result, the demographic shift that Brexiteers had anticipated is happening faster than expected. However, with Europe's once flexible labor market gone, economic efficiency has plummeted. In the one domain they pledged to protect, the government is now completely in the dark. All right, let us do our best to summarize this catastrophe. Why was it even necessary? Did it have any use? Despite debunking these claims, Brexiteers will use the freedom to choose our own VAT rates and the somewhat quicker approval of vaccines as reasons to vote for Brexit. They are evidence of sovereignty. Surrender, however, is an emotion. Federalism is not something you can consume. You won't be able to use sovereignty to heat your house. The cost of holding on to that emotion has been enormous. Only the United Kingdom's economy has shrunk since the epidemic began. The others have all grown. In the next 2 years, the OECD predicts that, with the exception of Russia, which is subject to severe sanctions, the growth rate of Britain's economy will be the lowest of any large country. Let it sink in. When it comes to economic performance, Britain is looking like a nation that everyone is out to get financially. The self-inflicted wound is on that spectrum. Just the scorecard showed the pound's decline. This was the world's way of informing Britain how much it's worth now. Less is the solution. Great Britain has fallen into poverty. The nation is less well-connected. The country's waterways are filthy and its schools are decaying. Here, an ambulance may take 3 hours to arrive, and the cops don't respond to 911 calls. As a nation, it seems to be in decline. We have depleted the public sphere. Everything seems a little worse for wear on the streets. There will be a closure of the stores. The quiet is the tragedy. Both major parties avoided discussing it for a long time. It was impossible for the Conservatives to acknowledge error. In the working class areas, the Labour Party was petrified of upsetting the Leave supporters. Consequently, a silent plot was devised. Politicians were acting as if nothing was wrong, while the elephant in the room smashed windows and ruined furniture. The stillness is just now beginning to shatter in the year 2025. A large majority of Britons now consider Brexit to have been a bad decision, according to the surveys. Voters are reconsidering their support even for it. Their bills are in front of them. They survey the bare shelves. Despite being promised a Ferrari, they read the news and think, this is not what I voted for. As a result, a defective bicycle was supplied to them. How does it conclude then? There isn't a magic bullet. There is no way to reverse it. Years would be required to rejoin the EU, and there's no guarantee that the EU would welcome Britain's return. As a partner, Britain has shown itself to be untrustworthy and unpredictable. Why would they reopen the door to anarchy? Britain has a challenging path ahead of it. A decade of no changes in store for it. Its relationship with Europe will need to be rebuilt, and it will be a hard process. Although it will not have a voice in the rulemaking process, it must adhere to European regulations. It needs to learn to follow the rules instead of making them. For those fighting for sovereignty, this is the pinnacle of shame. Brexit is a message to the rest of the globe, that's all. That democracy is precarious is a message it sends. We learn from it that deceit does not go unpunished. As a result, we should take note that economics and politics are inseparable. Anger, nostalgia, and the refusal to listen to experts will lead to a political platform that will bring down the economy. Nothing matters to the markets more than your flag. The markets are unconcerned with your prior success. Markets prioritize consistency and ground truth. Fantasy triumphed over reality for Britain. Moreover, the payment is now due. The firing of the last shot occurred in 2016. However, bleeding has persisted in the patient. It was more than a simple currency fluctuation that caused the pound to fall. An empire's beating heart had finally stopped. In retrospect, this era will seem perplexing to historians. They will wonder why a prosperous country would penalize itself when it is doing so well economically. This group will likely wonder how a populace could be led to accept its own economic collapse via voting. What makes a nation powerful in the modern day will be tragically misunderstood, and the solution will be a red bus and a falsehood. Being strong does not mean being alone. Uniting as one is a powerful force. Britain never heeded such advice, and it is suffering daily as a result.